And do you remember the days of the Nintendo 64? When computing power was limited and every byte and every CPU cycle mattered. For you, that was 1995, and for me, that is today, because I'm still developing on the Nintendo 64. I've recently published a video about trying to find the best sign function to save some computing costs for our poor N64. And boy, this video got a lot more attention than I expected. Many people left comments or even wrote articles offering their own solution and ideas. Some good, some worse, but in the end, someone even came up with a whole new way to compute sine and cosine that I'm not sure anyone else had thought of before. That has all the right features to be the perfect sine and cosine function, tailor-made for the Nintendo 64 and possibly only the Nintendo 64. I'll explain this new algorithm and go over a few tricks we developers like to use today. In case you forgot or just didn't watch the first video, let me recap real quick why sine is important in the world of Mario 64. In the Mario 64 universe, sine and cosine dictate how everything moves. When Mario takes a step forward, he's multiplying his forward velocity with the sine of the jaw to move on the x-axis and the cosine of the jaw to move on the z-axis. And when an animated object moves any limb at all, we'll need free sine and free cosine function calls to calculate how the body part should look like in 3D space. These functions are used hundreds of times in a single frame, so even a small improvement here can be a big improvement across the entire game. We want to approximate our sine and cosine functions using a polynomial. A second order even polynomial is a function that looks like this, and a third order odd polynomial will look like this. Similarly, a fourth order even polynomial would look like this, and so on and so on. A higher order polynomial usually means our function is more accurate to the real sine or cosine, but it also means it will become a lot more expensive to compute. So ideally, we want to keep the order as low as possible while keeping as much accuracy as we can. Last time we dove into this world, the best we found for the graphics was a slightly rough around the edges third order sine with an insane speed but a rather low accuracy. This is how the math and function look like, and the max error of this was around 0.02, as you can see when I overlay our approximation and the real sine. For the gameplay, precision was much more important, making a fourth order cosine our pick. The math and function look like this, and our max error of this was around 0.003. Let's see if and how we can improve this. The most common response I've gotten to my video was that I should have used numerical approaches for the fourth order cosine, and I absolutely agree. This is 3 to 4 times more accurate for no speed cost. Very nice. I believe this to be the best fourth order cosine polynomial we can get. But let's not dwell on this. There's still a lot of video left, and we can get something a lot better than a naive, and big quotation marks naive polynomial. Before I can explain the big new cool function, I have to talk about the role of the square root instruction in this function. Trust me, it will be important. Programmers typically avoid square roots because they are slow. Right now I am computing the cosine from the sine using the fact that their squares always sum up to 1. To avoid this, the suggestion is to use the fact that the cosine is always a quarter rotation, pi divided by 2 ahead of the sine, and just shift the argument and run the same function again. At first glance, it seems promising. Thought of third order sine using the third order polynomial formula costs 26 cycles. Using the square root to compute cosine from the other identity costs 39 cycles, which is 13 cycles more. But there's a catch. The square root is what guaranteed that the vector spanned by sine and cosine was normalized to exactly 1. By using the other method, our sine and cosine won't combine, causing pretty noticeable inaccuracies in how the limbs scale. So I'm fairly confident in saying that the square root earned its place in this function. Besides, and this is why I insisted on explaining the importance of the square root first, there's another really cool trick we can do with the square root, and that is the folded polynomial. One fateful day, after releasing the sine video, a man named Silaslock joined my Discord and posted his new sine idea with a great mathematical proof for its accuracy. He realized we could also fold the sine and the cosine into each other for a polynomial. The new function is faster, 3 times more accurate, and only uses a second order polynomial. Wait, what? A second order polynomial is more accurate than a third order polynomial? How could that be possible? A lower order usually means less accuracy. His new function managed to do this by finding a way to abuse an additional symmetry of the sine wave. While usually you can only make a polynomial more accurate by increasing the order, this extra symmetry lets us cut the range of the polynomial in half. Having a smaller range lets us focus on just this range and pick numbers that fit better in the small range, and we end up with a huge accuracy boost. Just to remind you, we need to compute both sine and cosine and have a graph that looks like this in the end. Silas realized that we actually only need to define the first eighth of our cosine function. Let me explain. Our function is symmetrical, so if it's valid on the first eighth, 0 to pi divided by 4, it will also be valid on minus pi divided by 4 to 0. This lets us get the cosine from minus pi divided by 4 to pi divided by 4. Next, if our function is valid from minus pi divided by 4 to pi divided by 4, then we can use sine x equals cosine of x minus pi divided by 2 to get the sine from pi divided by 4 to 3 pi divided by 4. But also, we know that from 3 pi divided by 4 to pi and minus pi to minus 3 pi divided by 4, we can just mirror our polynomial to get the result. And, as you can probably guess, from minus 3 pi divided by 4 to pi divided by 4, we can just use the mirrored sine. And because now we have the whole range covered with either sine or cosine, we can compute the missing sine or cosine values from the square root of 1 minus the result squared. And by computing the square root of 1 minus the result squared, we can fill out the rest of the graph to get all the values. Every single symmetry of the sine wave is used here. The graph is divided into 4 quarters this way. All we have to do is shift our angle by 90, 180 or 270 degrees to get the number into the quarter where the polynomial formula works. This is done with some extremely efficient bit math that I don't want to get into right now, but this is what the code looks like. And then we just run the polynomial. It is either going to compute the correct absolute value of the sine or the correct absolute value of the cosine, and we can decide afterwards which one we just calculated by swapping the results around depending on how big our shift was. And the beautiful part here is that the square root does 2 things. It computes 1/2 of the graph, but it also computes the sine from the cosine or the cosine from the sine. All we need to do after we've decided which value is sine and which one is cosine from our angle is potentially flip some signs and we're good to go. In this way, we've managed to integrate the thought-to-be expensive square root to get even more accuracy out of these symmetries. We've managed to make it on average 1.5 cycles faster than the previous implementation. For comparison, we were using 65 cycles to compute before, and now we're using 63.5 cycles on average. I did some performance testing and this resulted in a 0 microsecond difference overall. Yeah, the measuring error is bigger than the potential benefit at this point. But we know this function is called about 200 times a frame, meaning we save 300 cycles, which on the 93.75 MHz processor that the N64 has, should save around 0.096 microseconds per frame. My measuring error is around 3 microseconds, by the way, so the performance improvement here is 30 times smaller than what is even measurable. But aside from the absolutely microscopic performance improvement, this also increases the accuracy threefold, which is just amazing. The combination of having relatively fast square root instructions and the fact sine and cosine are being used at the same time almost always makes this the perfect fit for this architecture and use case. The same suggestion also applies to the 4th order cosine, and applying numerics to move around the numbers a little leads us to an error 90 times slower than before. And here's a little table of all the max errors and cycle counts all the previous approximations had, in case you're interested, so you can just see how great this new algorithm is. While before, the max inaccuracy was at 36 angle units, something a super experienced and observant player might be able to detect, the new max inaccuracy is just 1/3 of a single angle unit in Mario 64. It's so small that Mario 64 wouldn't even be able to represent it. Even vanilla Mario 64's much slower functions had angles that were off by up to 15 units. So we can confidently say that we've made Mario's control a good bit more accurate. I've also worked with Silas to improve the arctant function to further improve the accuracy of the controller and find a bit of performance, but that's a story for another day. Unfortunately, this new function is 1.5 cycles slow on average, but honestly, we do not care at all. Over the entire frame, that will cost us at most 30 nanoseconds. Keep in mind, our CPU finishes the frame here in about 10 milliseconds, while the renderer takes 33 milliseconds. So only a fraction of our CPU speed will actually translate into render speed. There were some other ideas suggested that I'll go over in a speed round real quick, just so we don't have to discuss these one by one in the comments. The Cordic algorithm. This one came up a lot. But after a glance at Wikipedia's implementation example, it's very evident that it's way too slow to be useful. The sheer number of multiplications and iterations means it will take much longer to execute than our current method. It's nice accuracy-wise, but there's just no shot for this one. The approximation sin x equals x was suggested a few times as a joke, and a few times as serious. But this is obviously a terrible approximation over the entire range. Even if we just allow that for small values, it will add conditions to our function and just clog up our CPU. Another really interesting idea that was suggested was a piecewise linear function. The idea is to pick several points on the sine curve and to interpolate linearly between them. But after crunching the numbers, a lookup table with 32 entries compared to the previous third order sine would give us a similar max error with a higher average error and take exactly 1 cycle more. And obviously, it doesn't even come close to the folded polynomial. Expanding the LUT to get some more accuracy would make our computation even pricier and increase the likelihood of it being flushed from RAM. Also, even a minimal LUT could face RAM flashes, since the LUT is going to be in data cache, unlike our polynomials, which can be entirely in the instruction cache. I haven't measured this, but just as an estimation, a random guess, I expect this function to eat about 10 to 15 microseconds with 32 entries. Unfortunately, that means none of those other ideas work out, though I appreciate the enthusiasm. Either way, I am super happy with the new sign, as you can probably tell. In conclusion, our rendering approximation is now 3 times more accurate and 1.5 cycles faster, while our physics version boasts a staggering 90-fold accuracy increase at the cost cycles. In theory, our game should now also compute the frame 50 nanoseconds faster, since the graphic sign function is used a lot more, but that sentence just now sounds so ridiculous that if anyone said that to me, I'd think they're making some ridiculous over-the-top joke. 50 nanoseconds is less time than it takes for my voice to leave your earbuds and enter your ear. Adding just one line of code somewhere will move the entire RAM around, and some things might randomly not be on a good cache line anymore, and suddenly your program might take 2 microseconds longer to execute. A big deal. That makes the literal measuring error an order of magnitude greater than the time we've saved here. Think about this. Imagine your friend told you they lost weight today, and you ask them how, and they tell you they clipped their little toenail. That's about what we did here, just a lot cooler. For this reason, we can't go by empirical measurements and how this will play out in a full game context, and just have to go with what we believe to be best. And I think the 2 new function ideas by Silas worked out just perfect for this. The takeaway here you should have from this video is that to write the best performing code, you should always ask yourself, what more assumptions can I make? And then to make sure that every assumption you can make is being used in a relevant way in your code. Either way, I'm happy with our new sine cosine function, and I hope you guys had a wild ride. Until next time.